For 20 years, this man baptized, married, and heard confessions. And during all this time, no one had a single question. Parishioners traveled to him from 100 kilometers away. The diocese held him up as an example, and the locals called him nothing but Batushka. And then in October 2024, all of this collapsed in one night. And it turned out that for 20 years, a completely different person had been living beside them. But to understand how such a thing is even possible, one must first see the place where it all happened. The village of Gubernskoye, Chelyabinsk region, 80 kilometers from the regional center, on the banks of Lake Bolshye Irdyagi. Here stands the temple of the Tikvin icon of the Mother of God, visible for several kilometers around. 2 stories, 2 altars. There are literally only a few like it in the entire southern Urals. They built it for 20 years, from 1879 to 1899, with the whole community. Merchants donated largely. Peasants chipped in kopecks. By the beginning of the 20th century, the temple had become the architectural dominant of the entire district. A zemstvo school, a market square, and merchant houses grew around it. And then the 30s came, and something completely different began. A ban on baptism, a ban on weddings, the removal of 35 bells from the bell tower. In 37, the temple was closed, and for the next 60 years, it stood empty. In 96, the church was returned to the believers. Services resumed, but the building required serious restoration, and the rectors there changed. And then, in October 2004, one of them, Alexander Selemenchuk, who invested his own money in the restoration, got into a tragic accident. His small car crashed into a harvester on a turn. A month after that, Igor Efremov became the rector. He was a mature man then, and behind him was a rather unusual path. In the late 80s, he played in the Chelyabinsk Mime Theater Prospect. It was a collective that worked at the intersection of pantomime, clownery, and absurdist theater based on Karms. Then the theater closed. Efremov went to the factory, and in 2003, he took holy orders. And from this moment begins that part of his biography that everyone who knew him would later recall. For 20 years, he restored this temple. Parishioners came from neighboring villages, from Chelyabinsk, some specifically for him. A large family, 5 of his own. In a 2010 interview, he spoke calmly and deliberately about faith, about the church, about upbringing, and gave the impression of a person who knows exactly why he lives. In recent years, he was quite unwell and appeared at services less and less, but this was perceived as the usual story of an older priest who gave his whole life to the temple. And then, October 2024, one night, after which absolutely nothing would remain of this reputation. And so, the beginning of October 2024, morning, and the police arrive at the rector's house. On the floor lies a man, a fellow villager, a person Efremov knew personally. Multiple injuries from a sharp object in different parts. The item lay nearby, ordinary, from the table. The injuries proved incompatible with survival, and the ambulance that arrived at the scene could no longer do anything. Nearby was Efremov himself, an older man, a priest, a rector with 20 years of experience, a father of 5, multiple blows, not 1, not 2 in some struggle, Many. The investigative committee opened a case under Article 105, Part 1, and Efremov was detained. The next day, the Argyll District Court selected a preventive measure. The investigator requested custody, but the court refused and assigned house arrest until December 15th at his place of residence. The Chelyabinsk diocese reacted on the same day. The secretary, Father Igor Shestakov, told journalists, not hiding his shock, "We are simply in shock. This is a glaring tragedy. He was characterized exceptionally positively all this time." Efremov was banned from ministry until the circumstances were clarified. The news spread through federal channels. Headlines were full of the word "batushka," and comments under articles numbered in the thousands. And everyone asked the same question: what forced a priest to take a sharp object and inflict multiple blows? Efremov gave testimony, but exactly what he said then remained outside the scope of publications at that moment. And so, to understand what happened that night, one needs to go back 40 years, to Chelyabinsk, to a world that had absolutely nothing in common with the church. Chelyabinsk, the second half of the 80s, the Palace of Culture of Chiechtiaz. Since 1981, a pantomime studio had been working here, which in 1987 received the status of a theater and began to be called Prospect. It was led by Valery Filonov, and this collective did not fit into any framework at all. Classical pantomime there coexisted with clownery, plastic theater with street performances, and a separate direction was the so-called strange theater, built on the principles of absurdity and surrealism. In December 1981, they showed the first play, The Blind, by Maeterlinck, and critics then wrote that this was a rare case when a pause sounded so weighty in a plastic performance. A story about spiritual blindness and insight, and all this without a single word. Then there were Asol by Grin, the dramatic tale Destiny, based on ancient Russian epics, the mime tragi show Buff, Marathon. In 1988, they staged a phantasmagoria play based on Carmes, anecdotes from the life of A.S., and a reviewer for the magazine Soviet Circus wrote then that the production was stuffed with funny gags and looked like a spicy dish. Next came the surreal story, Number 9, and here is what is important to understand. This theater did not just exist by itself. It organized festivals. In 1987 and 1988, it was the Chelyabinsk Carousel, and in 1989, they held the All-Union Festival of Amateur Pantomime Theaters, premieres, 30 collectives, more than 400 artists from all over the Union and abroad. So, Igor Efremov worked in this very collective, a young actor among people who professionally existed in the space between meaning and absurdity. Mimes do not speak, they show. Put on masks, take off masks. The physical form becomes an instrument, and the face turns into a blank sheet. The last performance of Prospect was called Sentimental Pictures, based on Gogol's The Overcoat, Nevsky Prospect, and Diary of a Madman. And it was shown on the stage of the New Art Theater. In 1992, the collective ceased to exist. The country was changing, theaters were closing, people were looking for ways to survive, And after that, Igor Efremov went to the factory. And then November 2010, at that moment already 6 years of service, and a journalist from 74.ru arrives in Gubernskoye to do a big interview with the rector. Efremov then spoke much and willingly, told about faith, about the temple, about the family, recalled that before the priesthood, his life was completely different. First theater, then the factory, and that every person comes to God alone. It cannot be done for company. But what is interesting, he devoted most of that conversation to the theme of evil and how one must fight it. We have monsters and vampires becoming a visual reality, thanks to advertising, television, films, computer games, as if the gates of the underworld opened and they all crawled out. And a young person stews in all this. Formerly, it was about upbringing, about how to protect the young from temptations, about the choice between good and evil, which, according to him, begins from the cradle. He quoted, "Sin lies at the threshold of a person from youth," and then added on his own, "It means we must teach him to defend himself in time to preserve himself, to defend himself, to preserve himself." Then, in 2010, all this was perceived as pedagogy, as the concern of a father of a large family, as a priest's reasoning about spiritual protection from temptations, and nothing more. There he also spoke about tolerance, and sharply, without any vague formulations, about the fact that one cannot call black white, and that a society that has lost moral landmarks will inevitably roll into the abyss. The interview turned out warm in the end. A lively person, a thinking priest, a caring father, and no alarming signals, none at all. So, 14 years later, one phrase from that conversation will sound completely different. Shestakov, in a conversation with journalists, added one more detail that would later surface in all materials. Father Igor rarely took part in divine services lately, as he was quite unwell. What kind of ailment, physical or otherwise, was not specified. The diocese did not go into details, but the fact itself was recorded. A person who served in this temple for 20 years simply stepped away from affairs at some point. The temple stood, services continued, but the rector himself appeared there less and less frequently. And what was happening to him in these months, and maybe even years, no one really knows. Did he still live in that house he built himself in the village for the family? Did he see his own? Did he communicate with at least someone from the parishioners? Almost no public traces of this period remained. As it would turn out later, his phone was turned off a few days before the arrest. He did not appear on social networks at all. The man simply went into the shadows, and then came October 2024. Beginning of October, the village of Gubernskoye, the priest's house. And here is what is important. According to the MASH Telegram channel, Efremov was drinking heavily during that period, and not for a day or two, but for several days in a row. The rector of the temple was simply drinking at his home. On the very day when everything happened, neighbors saw him in the yard, and what they later described sounds strange even in retelling. The priest battled with dark forces. What exactly this meant remained unclear. Did he shout, wave his hands, talk to someone who wasn't there? This metaphor, which MASH sources used, is not deciphered in any way, and it is unknown whether these are the words of the neighbors themselves or already the interpretation of journalists. But the fact is that the person behaved unusually in the middle of the day, in plain sight. And here is what is important to understand. No one intervened. No one called, neither the police, nor the ambulance, nor relatives. The village is small. Everyone knows each other. They knew this priest for 20 years. But that day they left him alone for some reason. Maybe they decided he would calm down. Maybe they just didn't want to get into other people's business. Or maybe no one understood exactly what they were seeing. By evening, he was home, and then a guest came to him. His name was Alexander Yurpalov, the husband of a teacher who worked at the local school, an ordinary fellow villager. And according to MASH, the reason why he came to Efremov at all was completely domestic. Yurpalov's car broke down, the very car that Father Igor once blessed. And now the teacher's husband apparently counted on some help, whether practical or symbolic. MASH journalists used the word resurrect. Efremov invited him into the house, and they began to drink together. Day turned into evening, evening into night, and what they discussed there, what they talked about all these hours, remained unknown. 2 adult men in the priest's house, alcohol, a long time alone. But here, MASH sources add one detail that greatly changes the whole context. According to neighbors and parishioners, Efremov had been drinking heavily not for a few days, for several years. From the moment the family situation changed, separation, illness, years of heavy drinking, gradual withdrawal from service. And so the story, which initially looked like a sudden breakdown, began to take on completely different outlines. Something in this person had been breaking down for a long time, maybe for years. Just no one saw it, or didn't want to see it, or preferred not to notice. So that night, 2 remained in the house, the priest and his guest. They drank until the very morning, and what happened in those hours is not fully known to the end. The priest's house, 2 people inside, alcohol, and a night that dragged on from evening until dawn. No witnesses, no cameras, no recordings, absolutely nothing. Only testimony that Efremov would give later, and this testimony, as would become known later, would be contradictory and confused. What did they talk about all this time? Maybe about the car for which Yurpalov came. Maybe about life, because for both of them it had been developing uneasily in recent years. Or maybe they were silent altogether, as people are silent who have nothing more to say to each other. Or, conversely, argued about something. And this argument went too far. It is impossible to reconstruct those hours by the minute. The investigation worked with what remained, with the place, with the item, with 15 injuries from a sharp object, with the testimony of the only one who survived that night. And then the night ended and morning came, and then dawn, the end of the night, the end of the conversation, the end of something that was already impossible to stop. Efremov took a sharp object, ordinary, from the kitchen. It just lay on the table and struck. Not once and not twice, the blows went to different parts. To the chest, to the stomach, to the hands. Yerpolov probably tried to protect himself somehow, to cover himself. Or maybe he could no longer do this. 15. This is the minimum that the investigation will later record, and in reality, it could have been more. And here it is important to understand one thing. One blow is effect. 2 or 3 is a struggle, some kind of fight. But 15 is something completely different. Yerpolov remained there in the house. The ambulance would not have changed anything. According to MASH, after this, Efremov moved Yerpolov outside. Why he did this is completely unclear. Panic? Some attempt to hide something? Or did he not understand at all what he was doing at that moment? And then the police arrived. The police arrived in the morning, and who exactly made the call is not fully clear to the end. Sources differ, whether it was the neighbors or Efremov himself. And here is what they saw on the spot. Traces, the sharp object. Yerpolov lay on the street, and nearby was the priest, alive, conscious, able to speak. He spoke, investigators recorded it all, but exactly what he told them then, no one reported at that moment. Official sources were silent. The diocese found out and was in shock, and telegram channels, meanwhile, gave out versions one after another, contradictory, unverified, sometimes completely fantastic. But all this will become known later. And for now, October 2024, Yerpolov was taken away. The priest was detained. A case was opened under Article 105, and a few days later, a court date was set, not on the merits, just on the preventive measure for now. Thursday, October 17th, 2024, Argayash District Court, a building that usually considers domestic disputes, separations, minor offenses, and now a case of 15 injuries. The investigator of the investigative committee stated the position of the prosecution: take into custody. The arguments were standard for such cases. Article 105, Part 1, is one of the most serious in the criminal code. A person is gone, and not from one blow in some fight, but from 15 blows. The accused was at the scene of the crime. The item was there too. The testimony was recorded. And all this, the risk of hiding, the risk of pressure on witnesses, the severity of the charges, usually means a detention center until trial. The court listened to all this and made a completely different decision: house arrest. And here it is important to understand, for a person charged with such an accusation, this is a great rarity. Statistics on such cases are completely unambiguous. The vast majority of those accused under Article 105 wait for trial in a detention center, and house arrest is an exception that requires some special circumstances. What these circumstances were, the court did not publicly explain. Age? Efremov is an older man, not young, capable of hiding somewhere or presenting a real threat. State of health? If this was recorded in medical documents, the court could well have taken this into account. Status: 20 years of priestly service, rector of the temple, a well-known person in the district, a large family, no previous convictions, no detentions. Or perhaps, was it in the testimony itself, in what Efremov told investigators immediately after detention, something that changed the whole picture of what happened and turned the story from a cold-blooded attack into something completely different? The court explained nothing, simply made a decision and closed the meeting. Commentators on the internet, understandably, were indignant. Hundreds of messages appeared under the news. House arrest for 15 blows. Are priests allowed everything? And if it were an ordinary person? And so Efremov returned home, to that very house in the village of Gubernskoye, where a few days ago he drank with Yurpalov, where he took the object from the table, where he inflicted these 15 blows. Now he had to stay there, under a pledge, without the right to leave, and wait until the investigation finished its work. In a conversation with Gazeta.ru, Shestakov added another important detail. He considers some publications in the media monstrous in relation to the person, including the victim. What exactly was meant, he did not specify, but it was clear that the diocese closely followed how this story was presented in the media, and they did not like everything by far. And in a comment for another publication, Shestakov spoke about Efremov quite directly. This is a very kind and decent person, a very honest priest. For me, information about this tragedy became a real shock. Kind, decent, honest, and 15 blows with a sharp object. And later, already in a conversation with Araya Novosti, Shestakov used one word that explained much in the position of the diocese. He said that Father Igor caused injuries to the local resident who came to his house, defending himself from him. Defending himself, it was not just a statement of some fact. It was a version, and a version that the diocese, apparently, considered workable. The priest defended himself. From what exactly, Shestakov did not say, but the word itself had already been spoken. Formally, everything was done strictly according to the canons. A ban on ministry is a standard procedure when a criminal case is opened against a priest, until the circumstances are clarified, until the court decision. Efremov remained a priest by rank, but no longer had the right to perform divine services, sacraments, or wear vestments. So, 20 years of service, not a single penalty, not a single complaint from the hierarchy. Parishioners who came from afar, a large family, interviews where he spoke about faith, about the choice between good and evil, about the fact that a priest is the same saving person with his shortcomings. And now a ban, house arrest, a criminal case. The diocese spoke of shock, of tragedy, of a kind person, but something else was read between the lines. They did not believe that their priest just took and did what he did. There had to be something else, something that explains it all. And the village of Gubernskoye, meanwhile, was silent. 843 people. That's how many residents are in the village of Gubernskoye, according to the latest data. Less than 1,000. a place where everyone knows each other, who is whose relative, who is friends with whom, who is at enmity with whom, a place where nothing can be hidden. And now what happened has happened here, and the priest sits under house arrest in the same house. The widow of Alexander Yerpalov, a teacher at the local school, remained living there, did not leave for the city, did not move to relatives, continued to work. Every day, she went out onto the streets of the village, where everyone knew what happened, and where the person who did it was located 2 blocks from the school. What she thought, what she felt, is unknown, because no official comments from the family appeared in the press. Not a single interview, not a single statement. Silence. And here is what is interesting. Back in October 2010, 14 years before all this, Father Igor spoke to journalists about his parish honestly. There are strictly few locals among us so far. Almost all are visitors. They come from the city, from surrounding villages, in summer residents. 3,000 people in the district, and most of them did not go to the temple. Not with us yet, the priest said then, although almost all consider themselves Orthodox. For 14 years, he tried to become necessary to this village, built a temple, served, baptized, married, then bought a house here, then built a new one. Then his family life changed. Then he began to drink, then stopped communicating. And now the village, which he tried to make his own, looked at what happened and was silent. Telegram channels published versions. Federal media repeated the words of the diocese about the shock. Commentators demanded a maximum term, and people who lived nearby and saw him every week for 20 years said nothing. Maybe they knew something journalists didn't know, or maybe they simply had nothing to say, because the person they knew and the person who inflicted 15 blows did not fit into one picture in any way. So passed the autumn, then winter. The investigation worked. Efremov sat under house arrest. The village was silent, and in March 2025, the case was transferred to court. On March 12, 2025, the prosecutor's office of the Chelyabinsk region reported the case was transferred to court. The former rector of the Temple of the Tikvin Icon of the Mother of God, Igor Efremov, is accused under Part 1 of Article 105 of the Criminal Code, not Article 108, exceeding the limits of necessary defense, not Article 107, effect, not the 114th, causing harm during detention. Simply the 105th, intentional infliction, a sanction from 6 to 15 years. The investigation worked for 5 months, studied testimony, checked versions, appointed examinations, and came to the conclusion it was not self-defense, not protection, not a forced measure in a critical situation. The wording of the accusation sounded dry, as fits a legal document. Conflict on the basis of personal hostile relations. A standard phrase from thousands of criminal cases, quarreled, alcohol, a sharp object at hand. The defense, meanwhile, built a completely different line. The lawyer insisted his client acted within the framework of necessary defense. He was attacked, he defended himself, and 15 blows are not a cold-blooded attack, but the panic of a person fighting for his life. Efremov himself did not admit guilt. At the sessions, he said that Yurpalov attacked him when he was sleeping, that his breathing was restricted, that he grabbed the object because there was simply no other way out. But here is the problem. His testimony changed. What he told the police immediately after detention differed from what he said at interrogations, and what sounded at interrogations differed from what he said already in court. The investigation checked all this and did not believe it. Collected evidence, inspection protocols, results of examinations, the nature of the injuries indicated one thing. Yurpalov did not attack, but tried to cover himself. The prosecutor requested 13 years in a strict regime colony, and so Efremov sat on the dock, an older man, a former actor, a former worker, a former priest, 20 years of service, a large family, and 15 blows that crossed out absolutely everything. On September 4th, 2025, the court was ready to announce the verdict. September 4th, 2025, Thursday, Argayash District Court. The judge read the operative part, and here is what sounded there. Igor Efremov is found guilty of committing a crime provided for by Part 1 of Article 105 of the Criminal Code of the Russian Federation. 10 years of deprivation of liberty, a strict regime colony, plus 1.5 years of restriction of liberty after release, plus 2 million rubles compensation for moral damage to the widow. The court gave 10. The court rejected the self-defense version completely. The collected evidence did not confirm that Efremov was attacked, did not confirm that his breathing was restricted, did not confirm that he had no other way out but to take the object and strike 15 times. Efremov listened to the verdict silently. An older man, 20 of them a priest, a large family, and now he is a convict under Article 105. The defense immediately announced its intention to appeal, and at the time of recording this clip, the verdict has not yet entered into legal force. But for the court of first instance, the case was closed. Conflict, 15 blows, 10 years of strict regime, and yet, just what kind of conflict it was, sounded dry and short in the verdict. But in the case materials, in the testimony, in the versions that the investigation checked, lay something else, something that, perhaps, explained absolutely everything. 3 versions, 3 explanations of what happened from one and the same person, and none of them were accepted by the court. Version 1 appeared immediately when the police just arrived at the scene. Efremov was conscious. He spoke, and here is what he said then: that he struck not a person, but a demon. Version 2 arose already at interrogations, and there the story was completely different. Woke up in the morning, felt unwanted contact, behavior of a highly inappropriate nature. The guest with whom he drank all night put him in a vulnerable position, and he began to defend himself. Version 3 sounded in court, and it was already classic self-defense. Yerpalov attacked, restricted breathing. Efremov grabbed the object because he feared for his life. And here is what is important to understand. Each subsequent version was soberer than the previous one, and each contradicted all the others. A demon, unacceptable behavior, an attack. The court checked all three and believed none. The nature of the injuries spoke of something completely different. This is not the desperate defense of a person fighting for life. This is fury, conflict on the basis of personal hostile relations. That is all that was established. And what exactly happened between the two men that night remained in the fog of alcohol, contradictory testimony, and the silence of the only one who survived that night. And now look back, 2010 interview. The priest tells the journalist, "We must teach a person to defend himself in time to preserve himself." Then it sounded like reasoning about upbringing and temptations. Now these words are read completely differently. There in the same interview, a priest is the same saving person with his shortcomings. What shortcomings hid behind the cassock for 20 years? And there too, monsters and vampires became a visual reality, as if the gates of the underworld opened. He spoke then about television and computer games. But that night, he struck a demon. So, the person who for 20 years explained to others how to live according to conscience could not explain why he did what he did. The temple of the Tikvin, icon of the Mother of God, still stands in the village of Gubernskoye. It was built for 20 years, then restored for another 20 years, and it remained unfinished to the end, just like this story.